Hello, welcome back. Today we are looking at Chapter 15, Section 2, Opposing Slavery. And our essential question for today is, how did reformers in the 1830s and 1840s become more active in calling for an end to slavery in the United States? Now, if you remember from yesterday's lesson, we kind of introduced this time period where people were feeling pretty good. Remember the era of good feelings, and we're looking around thinking, I feel like things can be better. Well, one of the biggest things in American history, and especially one of the biggest things at this time, was slavery. And we'll look today at how reformers started to push for legislation to kind of call for an end to slavery in the United States. And I want to pick up now with our key terms. And our key terms for today are American Colonization Society, abolitionist, the liberator, and the Underground Railroad, which I hope you all know is not an actual railroad. But we'll talk about that after our next video. And this first video that we're going to be watching today will kind of give us an insight into slavery, but in the words of somebody who had lived it.
Men may write fictions portraying lowly life as it is, or as it is not. May expatiate with owlish gravity upon the bliss of ignorance, discourse flippantly from armchairs of the pleasures of slave life. But let them toil with him in the field, sleep with him in the cabin, feed with him on husks. Let them behold him scourged, hunted, trampled on, and they will come back with another story in their mouths. Let them know the heart of the poor slave, learn his secret thoughts, thoughts he dare not utter in the hearing of the white man. Let them sit by him in the silent watches of the night, converse with him in trustful confidence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they will find that 99 out of every 100 are intelligent enough to understand their situation and to cherish in their bosoms the love of freedom as passionately as themselves. Solomon Northrop, 12 years a slave.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. This previous quote is straight from a well-known document, the Declaration of Independence. But that term, all men, at this time, and when the Declaration was written, that term, all men, was up for debate. Did all men really mean all men? Well, it didn't. Many Americans, Thomas Jefferson included, believed that African American slaves should not be given the same rights and freedoms as white Americans. But gradually, we're starting to see that more people began to disagree with that belief. Now, by the early 1800s, slavery was basically extinct in the North. Industrialization had really limited the need for slavery, and religious movements, like the Second Great Awakening, promoted ideals that it was actually a sin for one person to own another. And in yesterday's lesson, we mentioned the Second Great Awakening, and some of the key preachers from that movement called on other Christians to join a crusade to stamp out slavery. If a man could choose to follow or to reject God, as they taught, then he should also be able to choose his place in life and not have it chosen for him by a slave owner. For these and other reasons, by about 1804, there were only about 50,000 slaves left in the North, compared to well over 1 million at this time in the South. Now, an interesting solution of sorts to the slavery issue in America was proposed by a group called the American Colonization Society. And their idea was to set up an independent U.S. colony in Africa for all freed slaves. And in 1822, President Monroe looked and said, I think that's a good idea, and helped set up the African colony of Liberia in Western Africa. And we're looking at Liberia as it stands right now. And the reasoning for this was that if African Americans were never going to have the same rights in America, then it seemed to make sense to move somewhere new. And some actually agreed with this. But most African Americans chose to stay in the United States because this was their home. Free or slave, they were born here and wanted to stay. So in the end, only about 1,000 African Americans moved to Liberia.
On New Year's Day, 1817, the concerned statesmen gathered in Washington founded the American Colonization Society, with support from the federal government. Its mission was to resettle free black people outside the United States. The ACS would list among its members President James Monroe, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, George Washington's nephew, and a famous anti-colonizationist from Tennessee named Andrew Jackson.
This is the same generation, bear in mind, that forced thousands of Georgia Cherokees to move to Oklahoma. And so the idea of moving people around to make this a more perfect white man's country was not nearly as irrational as it often seems to us.
Days after its founding, the American Colonization Society contacted James Forten, a wealthy businessman in Philadelphia's black community. The ACS hoped free black people would see their future in a place like Sierra Leone, an English colony on the coast of West Africa.
There were a good number of free blacks, moderately prosperous blacks, barbers, artisans, tavern keepers, who simply had enough and decided to go. They were weary of endless white demands for deference. They were tired of getting off the sidewalk when a white man walked toward them. They decided, as the antebellum period dragged on, that America never would give them an even break.
Paul Cuffey, a black shipping merchant from Massachusetts, wrote that the citizens of Sierra Leone were instilled with every privilege of freeborn citizens. On January 15, 1817, a meeting was called at Bethel Church to respond to the Colonization Society's proposition.
This was a meeting that absolutely packed Bethel Church with 3,000 men, constituted the vast majority of the adult men in the black community. It was a tremendous meeting, and led by the very people that they had the greatest reason to respect: Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, James Forten, men who had proven themselves over and over again, whom the community was accustomed to look to for leadership, for assistance, for guidance.
That night, Forten and other leaders argued in favor of setting sail for African shores. But when a vote was called, Forten later wrote, a no was heard that sounded as if it would bring down the walls of the building. The assembly gathered that night adopted the following resolutions without one dissenting vote.
Whereas our ancestors, not of choice, were the first successful cultivators of the wilds of America, we, their descendants, feel ourselves entitled to participate in the blessings of her luxuriant soil. We will never separate ourselves voluntarily from the slave population of this country. They are our brethren by the ties of consanguinity of suffering and of wrong.
So eventually, the movement to end slavery gained momentum, and abolitionists, those who wanted to bring a complete end to slavery in the United States or to abolish it, hence abolitionists, abolitionists fell into really one of two main camps: gradual abolitionists or immediate abolitionists. Now, gradual abolitionists felt that slavery should be allowed to die out on its own because that way it would be less disruptive to society and it would be a more peaceful solution. If it was kept out of the Western territories, then eventually the need for slavery would die out on its own. But immediate abolitionists, like the name implies, believed that slavery was a moral wrong and should be ended everywhere at once because it caused needless suffering. And which do you think was the more convincing argument? Should abolitionists have made a stronger push to end slavery everywhere at once, or should they have pushed for it to end peacefully over time? What do you think? And there's a reason why I ask you which is the more convincing argument. Now, when you think of abolitionists, you can't really think of one person or one type of person because people from all walks of life joined the abolitionist movement. You had free African Americans, white Northerners, Protestant preachers, and even some Southerners who hated the idea of slavery. Not every Southerner felt that slavery should continue. There were Southerners who felt that it was a moral wrong and that it should be ended. Now, some tried to end slavery through lawsuits and petitions, while others printed stories about the brutal treatment of slaves. And the most influential of the abolitionist newspapers was one known as The Liberator, created by a man named Mr. William Lloyd Garrison. The Liberator pushed for an immediate end to slavery and promoted slavery as an unnecessary evil in American society. So the writers and contributors to The Liberator were immediate abolitionists. And even some African Americans, such as David Walker, spoke out against slavery and called for slaves to rise up against their owners. So some of the immediate abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of The Liberator, and David Walker, a freed African American, who, like I said, called for slaves to rise up against their owners.
In Boston, David Walker had never been anyone's property. He made a good living as a used clothing merchant, but his father had been a slave, and in 1829, Walker launched his own private war on slaveholders.
America is more our country than it is the whites. The greatest riches in all America have arisen from our blood and tears, and they will drive us from our property and home. They must look sharp, or this very thing will bring swift destruction upon them. David Walker.
Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world violently condemned American slavery and racism and called for slaves to rise up against their masters. Racial bondage, prophesied Walker, was an abomination which would call divine wrath down upon the country.
Walker said, no, black people are Americans and they deserve to be not only freed but treated as citizens of this country. He utilized the rhetoric of the nation, the rhetoric of liberty, of equality, the Declaration of Independence, and threw it back in the face of white America, charging the nation with being hypocrites, with violating their own professed ideals.
Walker smuggled his appeal into the South by sewing it into the coats of black sailors. Its fiery rhetoric announced a radical shift in the struggle to abolish slavery. Southern officials put a price on Walker's head: $1,000 dead, $10,000 if taken alive.
3 states Georgia, Louisiana, and North Carolina, as a direct result of Walker's appeal, passed legislation making it a crime to teach slaves, or in fact blacks, free or slave, from being able to read and write. And the South will now begin, after the early 30s, to limit civil liberties in a major way, limiting freedom of press, freedom of the speech, as a result of the abolition movement.
David Walker died under mysterious circumstances. 2 years later, in 1831, when Nat Turner's slave revolt in Virginia left more than 55 whites dead, Southern officials blamed it on publisher William Lloyd Garrison and his Boston newspaper, The Liberator. At age 26, Garrison was impoverished. He slept in his tiny press office and was ridiculed for hiring a black apprentice. His anti-slavery newspaper was in continual danger of going under, but Garrison's passion to destroy slavery soon made him notorious among slavery supporters. Like other abolitionists, he threatened an American way of life.
Garrison was also one of the few white abolitionists who shouldered up to David Walker, and actually he serialized parts of Walker's appeal in The Liberator. And in 1831, after Walker's death, Garrison believed that through moral suasion, as it was called at the time, by an onslaught of persuasion, that Southerners over time could be convinced of the sin of slaveholding.
Before God, such a glaring contradiction as exists between our creed and practice, the annal of 6,000 years cannot parallel. I am ashamed of my country. I am sick of our unmeaning declamation in praise of liberty and equality, of our hypocritical cant about the unalienable rights of man. We are guilty, all guilty, horribly guilty. William Lloyd Garrison.
Black activists gave Garrison money, sold subscriptions, and filled his newspaper with their own anti-slavery writings. 3 out of 4 subscribers were black. The Liberator became the voice of the abolition crusade.
Now, an interesting offshoot of the abolitionist movement came from the work of 2 sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, and they were daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder who joined the abolitionist movement in Philadelphia. And though they spoke out very publicly against slavery, they drew criticism from a lot of people, including other abolitionists, because they were women. At this time, it was still believed that a woman should not speak out in public, but as Sarah stated, whatever is morally right for a man to do, it is morally right for a woman to do. Now, we won't get into this now, but eventually we're going to see how this belief would spark the crusade for women's rights. So that's an interesting offshoot of the abolitionist movement. But the best known of all American abolitionists, and definitely of all African American abolitionists, really has to be a former slave named Frederick Douglass. Douglass had been born into slavery in Maryland, but defied the slave codes by learning how to read. And in 1838, he escaped the South to New England, where he became very, very involved in the anti-slavery movement there. He gave these very impassioned lectures about the evils that he had personally experienced as a slave and what freedom would mean not just to him but to all people. And he was soon traveling across the United States and Britain lecturing against slavery, and in 1847 published an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star. And our next video is going to kind of tell the story of Frederick Douglass and his entrance into the abolitionist movement.
In 1841, a runaway slave, a tall, handsome man named Frederick Douglass, spoke up at an abolitionist meeting on Nantucket Island near Boston.
I felt strongly moved to speak, But the truth was, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down.
Yet somehow he found the courage to speak out. That evening, Frederick Douglass told his own story, how he had lived and what he had seen. That was enough to send chills down the backs of his listeners.
I never saw my mother more than 4 or 5 times in my life. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot, 12 miles, after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise. I do not recollect ever seeing my mother by the light of day.
As a young slave, Frederick became determined to read and write. He traded bread with white children for reading lessons. But when he was sent away to a cruel new master, he was beaten with a whip until he was bloody and scarred. He wasn't given enough to eat. He was sent into the fields to work long hours.
But for the hope of being free, I have no doubt that I should have killed myself.
What happened next was all put down in a book he wrote called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. What he left out of his book was a description of exactly how he had escaped to freedom. If he had included it, the slave catchers would have known how to capture others who were using the same route. By 1850, Douglass had become a hugely influential leader and editor of the abolitionist newspaper, the North Star.
People in general will say they liked colored men as well as any other, but in their proper place. They assign us that place. They don't let us do it ourselves, nor will they allow us a voice in the decision. They will not allow that we have a head to think, and a heart to feel, and a soul to aspire. You degrade us, and then you ask why we are degraded. You shut our mouths, and then ask why we don't speak. You close your colleges and seminaries against us, and then ask why we don't know more.
Frederick Douglass was probably the greatest figure in the abolitionist movement. He represents the fact that African Americans played a major role in the struggle against slavery. The notion of racial inequality was deeply embedded in American society. In a country that defines itself as a land of liberty, you need an explanation for why 4 million people are deprived of liberty. Racial inequality becomes that explanation. It becomes the reason why you can have slavery in a land of freedom.
Now, like any movement, it's one thing to talk about stuff, but it's another to actually take action and try to do something. It's one thing to just talk about the evils of slavery, but it's another thing to try and make a difference. And while many abolitionists were talking about ending slavery, some were actually trying to help runaway slaves secretly escape to freedom in the North and eventually up into Canada. And this network of black and white abolitionists became known as the Underground Railroad. And like I mentioned before, it wasn't actually a railroad, but conductors would guide runaway slaves to different stations. And these stations were homes with secret rooms, churches, caves, any place that these escaped slaves could be hidden and spend the night before moving on to another location. And as we see in this map, there was a system that went up through northern states, and many of these routes ended in Canada. And a name that is basically synonymous with the Underground Railroad is that of a very famous conductor and former slave herself, Harriet Tubman, who we can see in this picture, her face being circled. After escaping slavery herself, Tubman returned to the South 19 more times to help over 300 slaves, including her parents, escape to the North. And slave owners hated her and put a $40,000 reward for her capture, while abolitionists praised her bravery and referred to her as the Black Moses, naming her after the biblical leader who helped lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt.
The Underground Railroad wasn't a train with boxcars and a caboose. It was a huge secret network of people dedicated to helping runaway slaves escape from the South. Slavery was widespread in the southern United States from the mid-17th century until the late 19th century. It was a cruel institution. African men, women, and children were bought and sold like property. They were forced to work long hours for their white owners and were often treated poorly. Many slaves attempted to run away, only to be caught and punished. But from 1820 to 1860, through the coordinated efforts of the Underground Railroad, it's estimated that as many as 100,000 slaves successfully escaped to free states in the North and to Canada. The Underground Railroad was named after the steam railroad, which was a new technology in the early 1800s. And many of its terms were borrowed from the steam railroad. It was one way to keep the Underground Railroad secret. A conductor was a guide who led escaped slaves to a station or depot. Stations and depots were homes or businesses that were safe havens for runaway slaves. And the runaway slaves were called passengers or parcels. Even with help from the Underground Railroad network, escaping slavery was not easy. Runaway slaves were always in danger of being captured, and they had to depend heavily on their smarts and creativity. Henry Brown made one of the most famous and unusual escapes. He mailed himself from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in a 3-foot-long by 2-foot-wide crate. But most escapes happened on foot.
Now, there was opposition to the abolitionist movement, and the movement continued to grow, and by about the mid-1800s, slavery had been completely abolished in the North, but, as we know, still continued very heavily in the South. Now, the movement itself grew, but managed to acquire enemies both in the South and in the North. In the North, northern textile factories depended very heavily on southern cotton and saw these attacks on slavery almost like attacks on their economic livelihood, and some northern workers actually feared that free slaves would come to the North and take their jobs. Anti-slavery meetings in the North and in the South, but more so in the North, were broken up by mobs, but the violence against abolitionists ended up bringing more people into the movement than it drove out. So, in a way, these mobs actually helped the abolitionist movement. And in the South, the most obvious enemies of the abolitionist movement were the slave owners themselves. And other Southerners accused the abolitionists of promoting violence and even blamed Nat Turner's rebellion on William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, even though the paper itself was founded only a few months before Turner's rebellion. Slave owners responded by defending slavery even more, and some said that if treated well, slaves would serve faithfully, and that slaves were actually better off than most of the workers in the North. And even some Southern whites who didn't own slaves defended slavery because it was so essential to the Southern economy, and were afraid that Northerners were trying to destroy their way of life. And so this issue of slavery took a country that was already divided on many issues and caused an even wider rift between the Northern United States and the Southern United States. And our final video is an interesting one because it's going to give the Southern reaction to and perspective of the abolitionist movement. So listen to the words that they use and the way that it's way that the abolitionist movement is described by a Southern gentleman and a Southern woman.
Slavery was becoming a sensitive national issue. The emergence in the North of the abolitionists, who flooded the South with anti-slavery literature urging blacks to rise in revolt, horrified almost all white Southerners.
Rise up, brothers, the sword unsheathed. Slavery is a hard foe to battle, I believe.
Slave insurrection was sufficiently widespread to arouse great fear among Southern whites, especially after the successful uprising organized by Nat Turner in Virginia.
The slaves cry unheeded, their anguish is spurned, but a lesson of vengeance may soon be learned.
Even after Turner and many of his followers were captured and executed, Southerners remained terrified of the possibility of more slave revolts. Slave owners and non-slave owners were united in this fear. Southerners were indignant when abolitionist writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had no first-hand knowledge of slavery, depicted slave owners as totally evil. They became increasingly sensitive to any criticism of slavery, even among their own people. Throughout the South, post offices were raided and mail from abolitionists destroyed. Citizens were jailed or publicly whipped for criticizing the treatment of slaves.
King Cotton is a monarch who'll conquer abolition, so let's not hear of compromise and nothing of submission.
Southerners began to defend slavery, maintaining that it was sanctioned by God, and that blacks were inferior beings who required their care and guidance. Whites insisted that their slaves were happy, and that they were far better off than the wage slaves of the cruel northern factories. Their argument that slavery was benevolent gained general acceptance in the South. And many Southerners felt that the extension of slavery into the territories was just and warranted.
Which brings us to our assignment. Now, our assignment for today has 2 parts, each of which is worth 10 points, so a total of 20 points. And you need to complete both parts of the assignment to receive full credit. So, part 1. The main idea for this lesson was that in the 1830s and 1840s, reformers became more active in calling for an end to slavery in the United States. I want you to decide the most powerful reason for ending slavery, whatever one that you think it is, and then defend that reason. And I need you to do so in at least a paragraph. So you'll be graded on your ability to fully support your position and the details used to defend your position. So part 1, decide and then defend the most powerful reason you believe for ending slavery. That's part 1. Part 2, even in the North, there were those who believed that slavery should not end, or that if it were ended, it should be ended very gradually. So I want you to, this one is also a 2-parter, choose one argument for keeping slavery and describe that argument, and one argument for ending it gradually, and then you can defend those points from either the position of a Southerner or a Northerner. We saw some of the arguments that were being used in the North, some of the arguments that were being used in the South, especially in the final video that we watched. And again, you will be graded on your ability to defend those 2 arguments and the details you used to defend them. And this section is also worth 10 points. So 10 points for part 1, 10 points for part 2. And like always, if you have questions on this assignment, please come and find me, because this one can be a little bit more difficult because you're really choosing 3 different positions and defending each one of those. So that can be very, very difficult. So if you need help or you need some ideas of how to get started, come and find me and I will do my best to help you out. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to reading your points and counterpoints.